From New York, this is Democracy Now!
We announced the unsealing of sex trafficking charges against Jeffrey Epstein. The charges allege that Epstein sexually abused young girls by enticing them to engage in sex acts for money.
Billionaire hedge fund manager Jeffrey Epstein's been charged in a Manhattan federal court with sex trafficking and conspiracy over a decade after the billionaire received a lenient plea deal from Alexander Acosta, who is now the nation's labor secretary. Calls are mounting for Acosta's resignation. Plus, we go to Brazil to speak with Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Glenn Greenwald, who's now under investigation himself and is facing death threats for exposing a massive political scandal involving Brazil's justice minister, the former judge who jailed former President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, paving the way for the election of the right-wing president, Jair Bolsonaro.
He was basically the commander of the prosecutorial team and then walking into court as though he were sitting judging Lula's case and others as a neutral arbiter. So everything that they vehemently denied to the public they were doing, in fact, they were doing for years, as these documents show.
Plus, we look at the ongoing fallout from the Trump administration's decision to pull out the Iran nuclear accord out of it, as the International Atomic Energy Agency confirms Iran's begun enriching uranium above the level agreed to by the nuclear deal. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Billionaire hedge fund manager Jeffrey Epstein was charged in a Manhattan federal court Monday with sex trafficking and conspiracy. He's accused of sexually assaulting and trafficking dozens of underage girls between the years 2002 and 2005 at his homes in New York City and Palm Beach, Florida, where he paid them hundreds of dollars to perform sex acts and help recruit other girls for him to abuse. Epstein's pleaded not guilty. Prosecutors seized a trove of photos of nude or partially nude young women and girls from Epstein's Manhattan townhouse Saturday, the same day he was arrested at New Jersey's Teterboro Airport. More accusers are continuing to come forward, prosecutors say. This is FBI official William Sweeney.
The estimated dozens of victims were as young as 14 years old at time of recruitment. Children who provided Epstein massages while they were nude or partially nude. Children who were asked to engage in direct and indirect sex acts for money. Children who were enticed to do all these things at the hands of a man more than or nearly 3 times their age.
Epstein previously received what's been described as one of the most lenient deals for a serial child sex offender in history for abusing and trafficking potential hundreds of girls by the U.S. prosecutor in Florida. That man, Alexander Acosta, is now Trump's labor secretary. New York prosecutors say their case is not bound by that deal. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi has called for Acosta to resign. Attorney General William Barr said Monday he's recused himself from the case because his former law firm, Kirkland & Ellis, has represented Epstein. He did not mention his father, the former headmaster of New York's private school, Dalton School, hired Epstein to teach there in the 70s, despite his not having a college degree. Prosecutors are asking that the judge deny Epstein bail, as he may be a flight risk. We'll have more on the story after headlines with the Miami Herald's editor, Casey Frank. Attorney General William Barr says the Trump administration's found a pathway to add a citizenship question to the 2020 census that would be accepted by the Supreme Court, though he did not offer any further details. The Justice Department also announced Monday it was replacing members of the legal team charged with arguing the administration's case. Experts say it's unclear whether the administration will even be able to amend or add to the constitutionally mandated census at this stage. When asked about the battle over the census, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi said the White House is trying to make America white again. New York Governor Andrew Cuomo signed a bill Monday which would give 3 key congressional committees access to President Trump's New York State tax returns. The new rule, which requires New York tax officials to release the returns for any specified and legitimate legislative purpose, will also apply to the president's staff as well as New York elected officials and judges. House Democrats have so far been unsuccessful in obtaining Trump's financial records through subpoenas or other means. The Ways and Means Committee sued the Treasury Department and the IRS last week over their refusal to hand over the documents. Congressional Democrats issued dozens of subpoenas to Trump businesses, including Trump Organization, Monday, as part of a lawsuit into possible emoluments violations by Trump. Lawmakers say Trump is profiting off as many businesses through the Office of the Presidency. The Justice Department asked an appeals court to block the subpoenas and the lawsuit. Protesters in Hong Kong have vowed to continue their fight following Chief Executive Carrie Lam's announcement today the highly contested extradition bill is dead. Protesters have been demanding Lam withdraw the bill and accuse her of deliberately using misleading language and making non-binding promises to quell unrest. Protesters have also been calling for the resignation of Lam and say they want the government to listen to all of their demands.
A lot of people are complaining about issues of the police abusing their powers, and there are also just fundamental questions of institutional governance. The government does not listen to the will of the people, and so I think this is a really good time to bring back the fight for genuine universal suffrage.
Organizers say hundreds of thousands took to the streets again in Hong Kong Sunday, including a massive march in Kowloon, where many mainland Chinese go to shop. That protest ended with several arrests and clashes with riot police, who at one point charged into a group of protesters with batons. In China, a new report by the BBC found evidence authorities are systematically taking Muslim children, many of them from Uyghur community, from their families in the far western region of Xinjiang. According to the report, China is rushing to build boarding schools where children are deliberately removed from their language and culture. Meanwhile, an estimated 1 million adults from the Uyghur community are being imprisoned in camps that China claims are vocational training centers designed to combat extremism. Many of the children who've been detained, many of the children who have detained parents or other families are more vulnerable to removal. The author of the report concludes, quote, "The evidence points to what we must call cultural genocide." Two indigenous rights activists and land protectors were murdered in eastern Guatemala Friday. Isidro Perez and Melesio Ramirez were attending a peaceful action organized by the peasants' rights group Codeca when 15 armed men stormed in and started shooting at the group. Codeca's leader, Thelma Cabrera, ran for president in last month's Guatemalan elections, placing fourth in the race. Last year, 6 members of Codeca were murdered for their activism in Guatemala. No one has been arrested for the crimes. In Italy, 24 people were sentenced to life in prison for their roles in Operation Condor, in which 6 South American countries conspired to kill tens of thousands of political opponents in the 1970s and 80s. 23 Italians were among those killed as part of the campaign of coordinated terror and assassinations carried out by the U.S.-backed dictatorships of Chile, Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, Paraguay, and Uruguay. Operation Condor was coordinated out of Chile, then under the dictator Augusto Pinochet, and with the knowledge of the U.S. government, and in particular then Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. Among those sentenced were former Peruvian President Francisco Morales Bermudez, the former Bolivian Interior Minister, the former Uruguayan Foreign Minister, and a former top Chilean intelligence chief. All but one of the 24 were sentenced in absentia. A German rescue ship has picked up 44 people, including babies and children, off the Libyan coast today after they were stranded at sea. The charity vessel, operated by CI, recently transferred another 65 migrants to Malta after Italy refused to let the ship enter its ports. This comes as human rights groups and German officials blasted Italy for arresting Carola Rackete, the 31-year-old German captain of the Sea-Watch 3 refugee rescue ship, as she tried to bring dozens of asylum seekers to safety. She's since been freed and says she plans to sue Italian Interior Minister Matteo Salvini for defamation. Over the weekend, thousands marched in German cities in support of Rackete and to call out the criminalization of humanitarian aid. President Trump said Monday the U.S. would no longer deal with British ambassador to the U.S., Kim Durak, following a recent leak of diplomatic cables in which the ambassador calls the Trump administration inept and dysfunctional. In cables going back as far as 2017, Durak questioned whether the Trump administration, quote, will ever look competent. Trump also attacked outgoing Prime Minister Theresa May for creating a mess around Brexit. Theresa May's office said in a statement it continues to support Durak. The UN's High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, condemned the dire conditions in which jailed migrants are being held in the U.S. and the ongoing separation of children from their families. In a statement released Monday, she warned the detention of migrant children may constitute cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment that is prohibited by international law. This is UN human rights spokesperson Ravina Shamdasani.
What we appear to be seeing in the U.S. Are policies that are based on detection, detention, and expeditious deportation of migrants without much regard for their human rights. This appears to be taken on as a policy of deterrence. However, this is completely a breach of the state's human rights obligations.
Senator Bernie Sanders and Congress members Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Earl Blumenauer are introducing a joint resolution today declaring a climate emergency. If passed, the resolution in itself would not compel any practical actions, but it aims to push Congress towards enacting a, quote, national, social, industrial, and economic mobilization of the resources and labor of the United States at a massive scale, unquote. Speaking to The Guardian, a spokesperson for Senator Sanders' office said President Trump has routinely declared phony national emergencies to advance his deeply unpopular agenda, like selling Saudi Arabia bombs that Congress had blocked. On the existential threat of climate change, Trump insists on calling it a hoax, unquote. The resolution comes one day after President Trump gave an address touting his administration's environmental leadership. Trump reportedly made the speech after consultants from his 2020 campaign said he's lacking support from several key demographics who are concerned with climate change. Environmental groups and scientists have repeatedly condemned Trump's attacks on the environment, which include leaving the Paris Climate Agreement, cutting clean water and air protections, and promoting coal production. Last year saw a hike of 3.4% in greenhouse gas emissions, the biggest rise since 2010. In Arizona, a man admitted to fatally stabbing a 17-year-old boy on July 4th because the teenager's rap music made him feel unsafe. 27-year-old Michael Paul Adams was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. He's previously been charged with assault, theft, and drug violations and had been released from prison just 2 days prior to Thursday's deadly attack. The victim, Elijah Alamin, was 2 weeks shy of his 18th birthday and had plans to move to Seattle and work in hotel management, according to his father. And in New York City, the Queens District Attorney Democratic primary race is headed for a recount after a tally of paper ballots last week left Borough President Melinda Katz with a lead of just 16 votes, ahead of newcomer 31-year-old public defender and Democratic socialist Tiffany Caban. Caban originally declared victory on election night as early results put her ahead of Katz by around 1,000 votes. Caban, who is backed by Congressmember Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie Sanders, ran on a progressive platform of ending cash bail, stopping the prosecution of low-level offenses, decriminalizing sex work, and going after bad landlords, police officers, and immigration and customs enforcement. Caban's supporters say over 2,000 affidavit ballots were thrown out and are calling for those to be counted in the final tally. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our listeners and viewers across the country and around the world. Billionaire hedge fund manager Jeffrey Epstein was charged in a Manhattan federal court Monday with sex trafficking and conspiracy. He's accused of sexually assaulting and trafficking dozens of underage girls between 2002 and 2005 at his homes in Manhattan and Palm Beach, Florida, where he paid them hundreds of dollars to perform sex acts and help recruit other girls for him to abuse. Epstein has pleaded not guilty and is being held in jail until a July 15th bail hearing. Prosecutors say he poses an extraordinary flight risk and should be denied bail. They're also moving to seize his opulent $56 million Manhattan townhouse, where prosecutors seized a trove of photos of nude or partially nude young women and girls on Saturday, the same day he was arrested at New Jersey's Teterboro Airport. On
Monday, U.S. Attorney Geoffrey Berman unsealed the Epstein indictment.
We announce the unsealing of sex trafficking charges against Jeffrey Epstein. The charges allege that Epstein sexually abused young girls by enticing them to engage in sex acts for money. The victims, all underage girls at the time of the alleged conduct, were given hundreds of dollars in cash after each encounter, either by Epstein or by one of Epstein's employees. The underage girls were initially recruited to provide Epstein with massages, and often did so nude or partially nude. These massages became increasingly sexual in nature and would typically include one or more sex acts as specified in the indictment. As alleged, Epstein also paid certain victims to recruit additional girls to be similarly abused. This allowed Epstein to create an ever-expanding web of new victims.
U.S. Attorney Jeffrey Berman also made an appeal to other women abused by Epstein to come forward and seek justice. Several accusers were present in federal court in Manhattan Monday. Lawyer Sigrid McCauley read statements from two of Epstein's victims.
Yes, this is a great day for victims, and I'm humbled and inspired by their voices, and I am gratified to get to read a statement on behalf of, first, Virginia Giuffre, and second, Sarah Ransom, both of whom are victims and clients. So this is Virginia's statement. After years and years of trying my best to shine light in the dark place of sex crimes that Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell and their circle of powerful people committed against me and girls just like me, finding the words adequate enough now to express how I feel is a tall task. But I can say without hesitation that I am deeply pleased that the federal prosecutors in New York have arrested Jeffrey Epstein, and our case is taken in a serious way. It is time for Jeffrey Epstein and those who participated in these sex crimes to be brought to justice. And this statement is from Sarah Ransom, another victim. The news of my abuser's arrest today is a step in the right direction to finally hold Epstein accountable for his crimes and restore my faith that power and money can't triumph over justice.
Those were the words of first of Virginia Giuffre and then of Sarah Ransom, both victims allegedly of Jeffrey Epstein. Epstein was previously accused of molesting and trafficking dozens and potentially hundreds of underage girls in Florida. But he ended up serving just 13 months in county jail after the U.S. prosecutor in Florida and now President Trump's labor secretary, Alexander Acosta, cut what's been described as one of the most lenient deals for a serial child sex offender in history. A growing number of lawmakers are calling on Acosta to step down immediately. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi called for his resignation on Monday, tweeting, quote, as U.S. attorney, he engaged in an unconscionable agreement with Jeffrey Epstein, kept secret from courageous young victims, preventing them from seeking justice. This was known by POTUS when he appointed him to the cabinet. Acosta resigned. Epstein has counted Presidents Donald Trump and Bill Clinton among his friends. Trump told New York Magazine in 2002, quote, I've known Jeff for 15 years, terrific guy. He's a lot of fun to be with. It is even said that he likes beautiful women as much as I do, and many of them are on the younger side. In 2000, Trump was photographed with Epstein at his Mar-a-Lago club in Palm Beach, Florida.
Epstein's arrest after more than decades of accusations is in part being hailed as a feat of local investigative journalism. In November 2018, the Miami Herald published a series of articles by investigative reporter Julie Brown exposing Epstein's crimes and the high-powered people like Acosta who protected him. In the wake of the investigation, Epstein settled a defamation lawsuit against the lawyer of some of his accusers, avoiding testimonies from survivors who were expected to take the stand. For more, we go directly to the Miami Herald in Miami, Florida, where we're joined by Casey Frank, the senior editor for investigations at the Miami Herald. He's helped lead the paper's coverage of Jeffrey Epstein. Casey Frank, welcome to Democracy Now! It's great to have you with us. Can you talk about the significance of the indictment unsealed and the charges against Epstein yesterday, and then go back to what has caused this all to unfold? Clearly, your investigation, the reporting of Julie Brown.
Well, the significance, I believe, is that the victims are finally being heard after years of being ignored and disregarded. And in fact, abused not only by Mr. Epstein, but also many of them felt abused by the justice system in the state of Florida, the U.S. Attorney's Office. Now, how this came about is the direct result of two dogged journalists, Julie K. Brown and Emily Michaud. Julie, for years, was involved in exposing some of the abuses in the Florida prison system, and she zeroed in particular on one prison for female inmates in Lowell, Florida. It came to her attention that many of the women in that prison were there because they had been trafficked over the years, and the subject was of great interest to her. She began to research the topic of human trafficking, and the name Jeffrey Epstein kept coming up, and so she decided to dig a little deeper. That's when she discovered this deal that was engineered in 2007 and 2008 by Mr. Acosta when he was the U.S. Attorney. Concurrent with that, Mr. Acosta had been named as the labor secretary designate by new President Trump, and she observed at his confirmation hearing that he got kid glove treatment by virtually all of the lawmakers who were there to grill him, with one or two exceptions. And so she decided to take a very deep dive into this topic, working with visual journalist Emily Michaud, and the result was our series of stories called Perversion of Justice. And I believe that the result of that series was what we saw yesterday, the indictment of Mr. Epstein, and finally some measure of justice, perhaps, for his many alleged victims.
And I wanted to ask you, Casey Frank, about some of the communications that you uncovered, the internal communications, and also the role of Acosta directly in meeting with lawyers for Epstein, and the decision of his office, his prosecutors, to let this occur at the county level, in a county court instead of in federal court.
Right. Well, the communications you're referring to are emails that were brought out during discovery from the various lawsuits that have occurred since the non-prosecution agreement was hammered out in 2008. And one of those lawsuits brought out emails between Mr. Epstein's very powerful legal team and members of the U.S. Attorney's Office for Southern Florida. And what those emails showed was that the attorneys for Mr. Epstein were truly dictating the terms of this non-prosecution agreement. They were very friendly and solicitous emails, and as one of the lawyers representing the young women in this case observed at some point, this was a prosecution where the prosecutors and the police and the prosecutors both seemed to gang up against the victims. It was very curious, very unusual, and as a part of that, Mr. Acosta held a private meeting with Mr. Epstein's lead attorney in the fall of 2007 at a local Marriott in West Palm Beach, Florida. And at that meeting, the two men worked out the framework of the non-prosecution agreement that was actually signed several months later. And as part of the agreement and as a part of those behind-the-scenes communications, it is clear that the attorneys for Mr. Epstein were insistent that the defendants not be told that this case was being settled. Hence, the the young woman could not show up in state court where this was diverted back after the feds said they didn't want to handle it anymore. The defendants were not told that the case was being settled. They couldn't show up to object, and the agreement was sealed for several months until lawyers went to court and got it unsealed. And here we are 10 years later.
And apparently this violated federal law, not telling the victims. I wanted to turn to Julie Brown herself, the reporter. We spoke to her earlier this year about her award-winning series exposing Epstein's crimes. I asked her about Alex Acosta's role in his case.
At the time that this case popped up in West Palm Beach, Epstein was very much affiliated with Democratic causes. He was friends with the Clintons. He had donated money to Governor Richardson in New Mexico, where he also owns a property. He had a lot of important friends on both sides of the political aisle. But that said, he knew at the time that since it was a Republican administration and Acosta was a Republican, that it was very important that Epstein realized it was very important for him to hire lawyers that had Republican connections. And that's essentially what he did. He people who knew Acosta and who Acosta looked up to. Kenneth Starr, of course, was someone that Acosta would have looked up to. And so I think it made it very hard for Alex Acosta to feel like he was going to go up against all these people.
So that's reporter Julie Brown, who broke the story leading to these indictments yesterday in Manhattan court. She's talking about the Democrats and the Republicans. President Bill Clinton's press secretary, Angel Urena, issued a statement Monday reading, President Clinton knows nothing about the terrible crimes Jeffrey Epstein pleaded guilty to in Florida some years ago, or those with which he has been recently charged in New York. In 2002 and 2003, President Clinton took a total of 4 trips on Jeffrey Epstein's airplane, 1 to Europe, 1 to Asia, 2 to Africa, which included stops in connection with the work of the Clinton Foundation. He had 1 meeting with Epstein in his Harlem office in 2002, and around the same time made 1 brief visit to Epstein's New York apartment with a staff member and his security detail. He's not spoken to Epstein in well over a decade and has never been to Little St. James Island, Epstein's ranch in New Mexico, or his residence in Florida, the Clinton spokesperson said. So, Casey Frank, if you can talk about this relationship. I mean, it's known that I think it's believed President Clinton took something like 20 trips on his planes, which I think Jeffrey Epstein himself called the Lolita Express. And also talk about his neighbor in Palm Beach, now President Trump, the relationship with Trump and Clinton.
Well, clearly people like the former president and the current president are going to be endeavoring to minimize any sort of contacts they might have had with Mr. Epstein over the years. And I guess the truth will possibly come out during court proceedings moving forward. Clearly, Mr. Epstein had a friendly social relationship with President Trump before he was the president, and clearly he had a relationship of trust with the former president, which sort of got entangled with the former president's foundation, and I believe he may have also donated funds to Mr. Trump's foundation, and it will be interesting to see whether those who have received large amounts of money from Mr. Epstein might be deciding to return some of that money in the future. One institution that comes to mind is Harvard University, which has received millions of dollars from Mr. Epstein. I would expect that that a lot of people who were friendly with Jeffrey Epstein, who visited his house, who received money, campaign contributions from Mr. Epstein, are going to be running in the opposite direction in the coming weeks and months.
And I wanted to ask you, in terms of Acosta and his first time in before the Senate, as you say, he was treated with kid gloves. Do you expect any further questioning of his role in Congress?
I would, although I've been surprised so far that he really hasn't been brought in and grilled on the thinking that went into this non-prosecution agreement. In the past, when he's spoken of it, and he's spoken of it very little, he said, I was dealt a very weak hand. The victims would not have made good witnesses, and the defense team that we were up against was incredibly powerful, which doesn't seem like a very strong argument when you're part of the U.S. Justice Department. But what's more puzzling to me and to many others is that he has said this was a good deal, and yet he went along with the idea of keeping the deal secret. And if it was such a good deal, I don't know why he wouldn't have been touting what a good deal it was afterward and saying exactly why.
When Epstein was jailed in Palm County Jail, many didn't even know he was in jail for the 13 months because he was allowed to go to his office every day, and he would then come back to the jail apparently alone in an entire wing of this jail. But talking about his lawyers and friends, I wanted to turn to Epstein's arrest has many of those high-profile friends and protectors on high alert. One of Epstein's accusers, Virginia Roberts Giuffre, says Epstein trafficked her to his friends for sex, including high-profile lawyer Alan Dershowitz, who's vehemently denied the claims. This is Dershowitz being questioned by Abby Huntsman on The View in April.
I don't allow my personal interests and values to intrude on my professional life. I think of myself like a doctor or a priest. If they wheel somebody, Jeffrey Epstein, into the emergency ward, the doctor's going to take care of him. If he goes to his rabbi and says, I want to make a confession, the rabbi's going to say, yes, I want to help you.
You're now being sued by one of the women who was involved in that original investigation of Epstein. Virginia Roberts is her name, who claims that Epstein lent her out for sex to some of his friends, including you, when she was underage. You've been very vocal in your denials. Now she's suing you for defamation, saying you're falsely attacking her, trying to intimidate her into silence. You said that you welcome this lawsuit. You want to take it on.
And I also welcome her coming on the show and accusing me face to face. She has never accused me except under the protection of the litigation privilege because it's complete.
This week, The View co-host Ana Navarro Cardenas tweeted that Trump's labor secretary, Alexander Costa, should be fired, offering Epstein a plea deal that kept him out of prison for life. Miami Herald reporter Julie Brown responded, tweeting, your colleagues at The View owe it to Epstein's victims to have their point of view on the show. Having Alan Dershowitz on without giving their point of view only serves to silence other victims. The View, Whoopi Goldberg, your show is crucial in reaching out to victims. Casey Frank, if you could respond to this, and we'll end with the clip that the Miami Herald put out of some of those victims.
Well, Mr. Dershowitz has been very loud in vehemently denying Ms. Giuffre's accusations, and I have talked to Mr. Dershowitz, and I've heard those denials personally. He did say in that clip that he welcomed the lawsuit, but this past month he also filed to get the lawsuit dismissed, so I'm a bit puzzled about that. I guess the chips will fall where they may as testimony comes out in Mr. Epstein's upcoming trial. Now, I will say that the Miami Herald has gone to court and sought to unseal some of the sealed documents in one of the ongoing, or one of the closed lawsuits, I should say. And last week, a judicial panel decided to release 2,000 pages with possibly more to come. So we're going to be learning a lot more about Mr. Epstein, his associates, his friends, and his activities, I think, in the coming months.
And very quickly, the significance of Attorney General Barr recusing himself, saying he worked at Kirkland Ellis. Jay Lefkowitz was one of Epstein's attorneys, but also isn't being talked about as much, and he didn't raise. His own father was the headmaster of the private school in New York, the Dalton School, and he hired Jeffrey Epstein many years ago. And what this could mean if something came out, not that there's anything nefarious about that, but who knows if that was one of what he felt was his conflict of interest?
Well, I don't know what the significance of that is. I would say this, that I have some confidence in the Southern District of New York, and I'm impressed that they went out of their way to reopen this case, because it would have been much easier to just let it lie dormant, and they didn't. And as journalists, we're gratified when we see the work we do produce results.
We're going to end with the video produced by the Miami Herald, where we hear the voices of some of Jeffrey Epstein's victims describing what happened to them. The clip begins with Michael Reeder, who was Palm Beach police chief when Epstein first came under investigation for sex offenses.
The sheer volume of girls, the frequency, sometimes several or many in the same day, the age of the girls. In some cases, there were victims that didn't know each other, had never met each other, but they had basically the same story.
I remember there was a staircase, and it was like kind of like a spiral almost.
And she brings us up the stairs, and it was like spiral stairs. You walked into his bedroom, around his bed, to almost like a very little hall, and then it was another door, and that's where everything would happen, was in his bathroom. He would have a dresser, and it was filled with, like, the first drawer was lotion, and then, like, the third drawer down was, like, sex toys. So we would take the massage table out and set it up in the middle of the room. And then he came in with his white towel on around him.
And then he just laid down in his towel on his stomach, and he was just talking to people on the phone. When he flipped over, that's when he said, okay, you can go ahead and take off your shirt and pants, but you can stay in your underwear.
He would want us to stand next to him, and he would masturbate while he stared at us, touched us.
The video report produced by the Miami Herald based on Julie Brown's investigative reporting. Casey Franks, senior editor for investigations at the Miami Herald, thanks so much for being with us. He helped lead the paper's coverage of Jeffrey Epstein. When we come back, we go to Brazil to speak to Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Glenn Greenwald, who's under investigation and death threat for exposing a massive political scandal involving Brazil's justice minister, the former judge who jailed former President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, paving the way for the election of President Jair Bolsonaro. Stay with us.
Eu brasileiro confesso, minha culpa, meu pecado. Meu sonho desesperado, meu bem guardado segredo. Minha aflição. Eu brasileiro confesso, minha culpa, meu degredo. Pão seco de cada dia, tropical melancolia, negra solidão. Aqui é o fim do mundo, aqui é o fim do mundo, aqui é o fim do mundo. Oh. Aqui o terceiro mundo pede a bênção e vai dormir. Entre cascatas, palmeiras, araçás e bananeiras, ao canto da Juriti.
Gilberto and Caetano Veloso. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
We turn now to the growing political crisis in Brazil in the wake of the Intercept's investigation into a judge who likely aided federal prosecutors in their corruption case against former Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva. The Bolsonaro administration announced Monday that Brazilian Justice Minister Sergio Moro has been granted a leave of absence from July 15th to 19th to, quote, deal with personal matters. Leaked cell phone messages among Brazilian law enforcement officials and other data obtained by The Intercept point to an ongoing collaboration between then-Judge Sergio Moro and the prosecutors investigating a sweeping corruption scandal known as Operation Car Wash. Lula was considered a favorite in the lead-up to the 2018 presidential election until he was put in jail and forced out of the race on what many say were trumped-up corruption charges. The leaked documents also reveal prosecutors had serious doubts about Lula's guilt. The jailing of Lula helped pave the way for the election of the far-right former military officer Jair Bolsonaro, who then named Judge Sergio Moro to be his justice minister.
The news of Judge Sergio Moro's leave of absence comes amidst increased calls for Moro to step down after new revelations of irregularities were published in Brazil's leading conservative magazine. The publication, in partnership with The Intercept, released new details into the extent of Moro's corruption. The publication had been one of Moro's chief supporters, but editors say the 8-page cover story, quote, reveals how Moro abused his judicial function as part of a cabal commanding the actions of the prosecutors of Car Wash. The publication goes on to say the communications analyzed by Veja reporting team are true, and the story shows that the case is even more grave than previously known. The cover shows Moro appearing to place finger on a scale with the line exclusive, justice with his own hands. New chats show that Sergio Moro committed irregularities, disturbing the scales of justice in favor of the prosecution in the Car Wash investigation. For more, we go to Glenn Greenwald, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, one of the founding editors of The Intercept. Glenn has faced death threats and a possible government investigation due to his reporting on the scandal. Glenn, welcome back to Democracy Now! Talk about these latest revelations and then the threats you face.
So the latest revelation was, as you noted, this cover story in the largest and most influential news weekly in Brazil, which is Veja. It's sort of like the Time magazine of Brazil, except that it's center-right or even right-wing. And that's what made that story so significant was, as the editors themselves admitted, and they did the story in partnership with us, they had spent 4 or 5 years believing the myth of Sergio Moro, that he was this incredibly ethical figure who was combating corruption without regard to ideology or party, and doing so in order to clean up Brazil and strengthen and fortify its democracy. They believed that myth and played a leading role in helping to construct it by repeatedly putting him on their cover. The covers of these weekly magazines are incredibly influential because people even who don't read political magazines see it. It's on every corner. It's what helped dirty and destroy the reputation of Dilma and Lula, were these magazine covers, and they did the opposite to Sergio Moro. They built him into this myth, and so these editors, when we began working with them on this archive, and they began reading what we've been reading over the last 6 weeks or 7 weeks since we got this material, were not just shocked, but really angered. They were betrayed that this person that they had really thought was this ethical, clean judge committed to principles of democracy was, in fact, not just on occasion, not just in sporadic and isolated episodes, but continuously corrupt in how he was conducting himself and abusing his power as a judge. And I think that's the most important thing to realize, is it's not just Lula's case, it's the entire operation of Lava Jato, of Car Wash, that put so many people, dozens of people in jail, was fundamentally corrupted because the whole time in secret, the judge who was presiding over the case, who's now the most powerful person in Brazil, even more powerful than the president, was engaged in corruption so shocking and severe that even the right-wing magazine that had been his biggest supporter has turned on him and is now in partnership with The Intercept Brazil to do a series of exposés on their cover, uncovering and unmasking this person who was celebrated not just in Brazil but around the world as the paragon of ethics, but who in fact was deeply corrupt.
Well, Glenn, last week Sergio Moro testified for 7 hours before Brazil's Congress and defended his actions and tried to rebut your expose. Could you talk about what happened? Because some members of Congress nearly came to blows at one point.
Sure. So it's been this kind of cat and mouse game. Sergio Moro first went to the Senate. I then went to the Congress and testified for 6.5 hours. He then went to the Congress, that same committee, and testified for 7 hours. And I'm now going to the Senate committee on Thursday, where I'll likely testify for many hours in the wake of his testimony. And while he was there, that day, news had broken that the federal police, which is under the command of Sergio Moro as Justice Minister, very similar to how the FBI is under the command of the Attorney General, has initiated an investigation into my finances. There's a division of the Brazilian government called COFI, which is designed to detect and monitor the movements of money of politicians and their families to see if there's bribery going on or the like. And since my husband is a member of Congress, I fall under the purview of that agency, and the federal police, commanded by Sergio Moro, has asked for all the reports of my financial activities. Coincidentally, after living in 15 years in Brazil, suddenly as I'm doing this reporting, and so that hearing that he was at before Congress is very tense for a lot of reasons. The Veja article had just come out, but also people were indignant that he's so blatantly abusing the police power to retaliate against me for the crime, in his mind, of reporting on his corruption. And after 7 hours of testimony, it was scheduled to go another 2 or 3 hours. A member of the opposition declared him to be a thief judge, a judge who's a thief, and the members of Bolsonaro's party, being the authoritarians and fascists that they are, tried physically attacking that member of Congress, and they came very close to a physical confrontation, and the judge, or the minister, Moro, had to be rushed out in order to protect his own security. That's how intense the outburst was, and it kind of gives you a sense for what the climate here in Brazil is as a result of the reporting that we're doing. And Glenn, the potential impact on Lula still being in prison as a result of the continued exposés about the railroading that he went through as a result of Moro's activities? So obviously the imprisonment of Lula was incredibly controversial, both because he was leading the presidential polls by 20 to 25 points, 15 points, at the time that he was convicted by Judge Moro and rendered ineligible when an appellate court with strange speed affirmed that conviction, which is what led to Bolsonaro's victory in the first place. So the question now becomes, there's pending cases that Lula has brought alleging that his process is unjust. Obviously, the Supreme Court is taking a close look at the reporting that we're doing, and in fact last week issued a decision 3-2 denying Lula's release, or a petition to be released from prison, but explicitly saying that they intend to revisit this pending further revelations by The Intercept. So obviously the reporting that we're doing about the corruption endemic to this process as a result of Sergio Moro's misconduct is putting in doubt all of the verdicts that he issued. I mean, imagine in the United States if a judge, even in a traffic court case, got caught secretly collaborating with prosecutors and encouraging them and instructing them about how to prosecute the case. Of course, it would be unimaginable that that judge would continue in office or their verdicts would be upheld. That's the same situation that Brazil now faces. The problem is it's causing a political earthquake because the cases where Judge Moro was corrupt had such profound consequences for Brazil and even for politics internationally, that to now have to confront the reality that it was all the byproduct of a corrupt process is really, really cataclysmic.
And Glenn, the death threats that you are receiving now, can you describe the threat you're under?
Sure. So, I think one of the things that people outside Brazil don't realize is that Jair Bolsonaro and his far-right movement is not quite like, say, the right-wing movement that brought Trump into office or that has ushered in this new extremist right in Western Europe, which tends to focus more on fear-mongering and demonization over Muslims and immigrants. A big part of Jair Bolsonaro's movement has been demonizing and stigmatizing LGBTs, claiming that we are pedophiles who want to convert people's children, really stimulating huge, intense levels of hatred. the only LGBT member of Congress prior to 2018 fled the country in under really, really serious and specific death threats. My husband then took his place. Ironically, he was next in line in the election and is also, of course, openly gay. And the threats we've been getting are not the kind of death threats that you get when you're a public official every day. People just write you a quick note on the internet saying, I hope you die or you deserve to be killed. They're death threats that include our very personal data, our Social Security equivalent number, sometimes our address, information that only people in official positions could acquire. They're very graphic and directed at our children, at our family, and at us personally. They're the kind of threats that obviously a lot of thought goes into and a lot of resources are behind. And that's why we take them very seriously and have been turning them over to the federal police. Unfortunately, that federal police is commanded by Sergio Moro, who, as our reporting demonstrates, is willing to cross every line and break every law in order to achieve whatever ends he deems just. And so our confidence in their ability or their willingness to investigate those threats is not very high.
Well, Glenn, we wish you all safety and security. Do you think this price is worth it, the work that you're doing?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when you go into journalism, this is the kind of thing you do. Journalists all over the world are covering wars. They're killed covering wars. There are journalists who work without the visibility that I have, uncovering corruption by police forces in small towns and are threatened or even killed. This is the kind of risk that you take on if you want to be not just a journalist, but the kind of journalist that confronts power. So, of course, the risks aren't fun, but at the same time, it's very gratifying to feel like you're using the guarantee of a free press for what it's for, which is shining a light on the corrupt acts carried out in the dark by the society's most powerful actors.
Glenn Greenwald, I want to thank you for being with us. Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, one of the founding editors of The Intercept, recently published Secret Brazil Archive, three-part expose revealing the judge overseeing the case that put Lula in prison likely aided federal prosecutors in their corruption cases against him and other high-profile figures. Please be safe. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, we look at Iran in 30 seconds. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
Well, fallout from President Trump's decision to pull out of the Iran nuclear deal continues to grow. On Monday, the International Atomic Energy Agency confirmed Iran has begun enriching uranium above the level agreed to by the 2015 nuclear deal. Iran's actions come in response to devastating U.S. sanctions, which have been tightened, even though Iran had been adhering to the terms of the deal.
Iran's threatened to continue to increase their production of enriched uranium if European signatories of the nuclear deal do not help ease the impact of the U.S. sanctions. A top French diplomat is heading to Tehran today to discuss the situation, to try to defuse it. Meanwhile, Iran has criticized Britain for recently seizing an Iranian oil tanker last week. We're joined by Trita Parsi, executive vice president of the new think tank, the Quincy Institute. His most recent book is titled Losing an Enemy, Obama, Iran, and the Triumph of Democracy. Welcome back to Democracy Now!, Trita. Can you talk about the significance of what's happening in the wake of President Trump pulling out of the Iran nuclear agreement, this latest French diplomat going to Iran, the oil tanker of Iran being seized, and Iran in continuing to and increasing enriching uranium?
So this was highly predictable. There was no one who could expect that Donald Trump could walk out of this deal, breach it, violate it, force others to violate it, and then expect that the Iranians would forever live up to it. So This is not a surprise. If there's anything that is a surprise, that it's taken the Iranians 1 year to start taking some of these measures. Now, it is important to note that these measures are obviously not in any way, shape or form positive. We should not be in this situation in the first place, but they're also not a massive proliferation risk at this point. These are small steps. They're easily reversible, and it's clearly aimed at signaling the Europeans to start living up to the deal rather than just making political statements in favor of it. Whether that will work or not remains to be seen. It is interesting that the French are going to Tehran. Perhaps the French should actually come and visit Washington, where the actual problem lies, and make sure that they can convince the Trump administration to stop sanctioning countries that are actually adhering to a UN Security Council resolution.
Well, Trita, some U.S. experts have estimated that Iran's so-called breakout time, the time required for them to develop enough fissile material for a bomb, is at perhaps 2 to 3 months. Could you comment on that estimation?
I've not seen any credible estimation that would put it at that. Under the deal, it was quite strict that the Iranians would only be able to have a breakout of minimum 1 year. There's nothing that has changed in what the Iranians are having. Even them having slightly more LEU than what was permitted under the deal doesn't change that in such a dramatic way. So I find that I'm rather skeptical of that analysis, and it seems to smack of the type of threat inflation that the administration is favoring in order to constantly move this issue towards a confrontation. And
can you talk about the significance of the oil tanker being taken by Britain, apparently at the behest of the United States?
This is an unprecedented move. The legality of it is quite questionable. The former Swedish Prime Minister tweeted about that just the other day, pointing out that even if there were any sanctions on the European side, Europe does not impose its sanctions in an extraterritorial way. That's what the United States has been doing for the last 2 decades. The Europeans do not impose their own laws on other countries outside of their territory. But it is clearly an escalation. Now we have a situation in the Persian Gulf in which some of the British tankers feel unsafe going into the Persian Gulf because of comments from some in Iran that they will retaliate by confiscating a British tanker as well. None of this is in any way, shape or form good, but we have to remind ourselves we're only in this situation as a result of Donald Trump unresolving a resolved issue. This issue was resolved. Everything was working. The Iranians were adhering to the deal. And we're only in this crisis situation right now because of the very unfortunate decision of pulling out of the nuclear deal.
And the impact on Iran of these sanctions, especially on the banking system of the country?
Well, you can't sanction the banking system of the country and then expect it not to affect everything else. Everything goes through banking. And as a result, the sanctions that the Trump administration has imposed on Iran in violation of a UN Security Council resolution is having a devastating effect on the Iranian economy. And as usual, it is the poorest people in the country that pay the highest price because they're the ones who cannot protect themselves from these type of pressures and sanctions. According to the Trump administration itself, already 80 to 90% of Iran's economy is now under some form of American sanction. So this is clearly as broad-based of a sanctions regime that we've ever seen in the history of sanctions, very, very far from the type of targeted sanctions that has been more popular to talk about. This is clearly untargeted and affecting everyone in the country, but primarily the people that are the poorest.
You have President Trump making history last week, walking into North Korea, continuing negotiations with North Korea, even though they shot off missiles and other issues. Many hailed it as a real, very important mark of what diplomacy is all about. Do you feel Trump is not taking the same approach to Iran because North Korea has nuclear weapons, and that's the lesson to Iran, that if you get nuclear weapons, you will be dealt with diplomatically? Trita Parsi?
I think it is quite clear that if the Iranians had nuclear weapons at this point, Trump would have been treating them quite differently and would have pursued a very different approach than he is. And this is the real dangerous thing. What the Trump administration is doing through its conduct on this issue and other issues, it is signaling a lot of countries in the world that we are unpredictable, that we are dangerous, that we are not trustworthy, and that you actually need to find a way to protect yourself from us. And unfortunately, that would mean for a lot of countries that they need to have some form of a nuclear deterrence. That is the last
we have to leave it there.
conclusion we want
so
other
much.
countries to take.
I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.